are the healers just bad? Or is Blizzard messing up the survival minigame in Mythic Plus dungeons? This is the question we have for today, after some consideration of some of the players reporting that they have started to more and more quit the healing role, as judging it a bit too stressful, a bit also too tankless compared to other roles, and they feel much better playing roles where they don't feel nearly as responsible or blamed by the rest of the party if something is not going right in their key. Now, what has happened in this expansion to sort of cause this problem is that we began Season 1 and Season 2 of this expansion where many of the mechanics in the dungeons were very heavy on throughput healing requirements. So consistent healing. It's not that one player was going to be one shot, it's that multiple players were going to be taking tons of damage consistently. You know, Ruby life pools, pretty much every single boss was just like that. You had Algetar Academy with the Ancient, even Vexamus, constant damage going on. You had Halls of Infusion with the first boss, but also the third boss, consistent damage coming out. Neltharus, you had pretty much all the bosses, but in particular Magma Tusk and even Forge Master Gorik was just tons of consistent damage. So back in those days, you know, a few months ago, much of the question whenever you entered a dungeon was, man, I hope our healer can keep us alive during the Raging Tempest boss in Nokud Offensive. Otherwise this group is done for. That was the biggest threat back then. Blizzard sort of rectified this. In this newest season in particular, they moved away, definitely way more, from these constant healing requirements of bosses and also of quite a few trash that did plenty of heavy AoE damage which required massive healing. Like for example the lovely Nokud Offensive packs, for example, in multiple points, not just this one, also this one as well, right? They moved away and instead they went for a more one-shot, heavy burst, heavy single target damage on multiple thrash mobs. Whether it is, for example, if we go back to more dungeons of this season in particular, you have something like Throne of the Tides, where you have the healing absorb thrown by the Sentinel, you have the casts of the Water Bolt that can end up one-shotting players, you have the chase of the Snapdragons, you have the casts of the big guy or the big lady in the middle. Not to mention these absolutely fucking demonic manlets. Where are they? These goblins right here, the Aqua Mages spamming Aqua Blast, which gets to one-shot you, etc, etc. And that's just for the trash mobs. For the actual dungeons is more of the same. You have the Flame Shock on Mindbender Gersha, you have the Chain Lightning on Lady Najjar, you go to Everbloom, you have Archmage Soul with Cinderbolt, you go out and you go into Dark Thicket, you have the massive Stomp of Oakheart, you have the massive AoE of Drezaron, the massive Feed on the Weak, single target damage of Shade of Xavius. All of this is not really about the healer carefully planning cooldowns, carefully weaving AoE abilities, pushing 300,000 HPS, it's just to try to keep one guy alive. Now, why is this creating so many problems? Moving from having more responsibility on the healing of the group to the healer, instead throwing it more on the rest of the party in staying alive. And you can see this one being perfectly visualized even in the super high top keys. You know, Ataldazar 32 world first has been timed as a 28-minute key. This timer is a 30-minute timer. Now you think of yourself of a super high level key being timed with like 2 seconds left because you have to do so much damage, mobs and bosses have so much HP, you really have to get to the finish line by the last second. No, this one was timed with 2 minutes left on the timer. Easy, chill. Why? Because the difficulty now, or rather the barrier of these dungeons, is no longer certain healing checks or damage checks you can no longer pass at a certain key level. Now it's just surviving one-shots. They are timing this with a couple of minutes left because they were able to survive one-shots. After they survived the one-shots, the rest was chill, the rest was easy. The super high one-shots is what is now gating going forward in these key levels, even if you technically had 2 minutes left in timing this key. The problem in shifting the requirements of the damage patterns of bosses and mobs and trash into more one-shotty, spiky damage patterns is the fact that you are stripping away even more power from your healer, right? If you were to think about the responsibilities in Mythic Plus, you get to like, okay, who's crowd controlling? Okay, everyone, but generally more focus and more importance is put on the DPS players and on tanks before the healers. Generally, even when you see some type of organization on who interrupts who, the markers for who gets to interrupt what, usually it focuses on the DPS players and the tank more so than the healer. Same goes for interrupting, not just crowd controlling. It's also DPS and tanks first, and then the healer. When it comes to planning your routes, planning around cooldowns, planning around big pulls, those are done by the tank and by the DPS, and you play around the cooldowns of the tank and of the DPS, not of the healer. Then when it comes around the importance of doing DPS, it's of course the DPS players and then followed by the tank with the healer dead last. When it comes to surviving one-shots, the most or highest priority goes on the DPS players and their defensives. After their defensives, their survival toolkit is the healer, with his healing and possibly external help on the DPS players. Lastly, you have the throughput. You have the just straight up healing the damage, which is on the healer, followed up by the DPS players' self-healing and survival tools. So when you take the stock of all the things you do in Mythic Plus keys, the healer has the least amount of power, the least amount of control, the least amount of things he can impact out of every role by a landslide. The only part in which he is more valuable than the rest of the group, he loses out on being good with interrupts, he loses out in being good with crowd control, in being good with damage, burst damage, AoE or single target damage, on big pulls, on everything like that. He loses out even on staying alive and surviving one-shots. We have now moved to a point where it's more important for the DPS player to have strong defensives, to the point where DPS specs with poor defensives fall out of the meta, like enhancement, like beast mastery, like balance, because they can't stay alive. Doesn't matter if the healer has strong defensives to babysit these specs, those, because they are weak by themselves, they don't even get to be that popular. So the only part in which the healer has more power, more agency, more control is the throughput. Now, what we just said, Blizzard moved away from in this season, the throughput. So now you are in a season where healers lose out in terms of value, in terms of power, in terms of importance to every other player, every other role in Mythic Plus, and their only power has been weakened heavily because now throughput is not even that important in the majority of the instances where you might fail a key. How many times have you failed a key this season because the healer just couldn't keep up with the incoming damage compared to the amount of times you lost out because players were getting one shot, players used defensives not properly, got hit by frontals, or you simply had too little damage, right? This obviously creates a power fantasy problem. As a DPS, you go in the key with your power infusions given to you by the healer, with your DPS pots, your DPS cooldowns, and you are happy doing tons of damage, seeing yourself high on the meter, etc, etc. You are satisfied, it's all good. As a healer, instead, you have lost even more of what little power you had in the key in Mythic Plus. Now, what are the problems with this? The problem is, of course, that even if the healer is losing power, that doesn't mean, especially in the eyes of the rest of the community, specifically DPS players more so than tanks, the healer isn't losing the responsibility, isn't losing the accountability, isn't losing the, well, that's supposed to be the healer's job type of mentality for many players, especially when it comes to one-shots, to heavy instances of single target damage. Players still automatically default to looking at the healer if something goes wrong and a player dies. This creates a situation where you, if you want to play healer, you are now playing a weaker spec because the strongest thing you have is your throughput, is your constant healing, and it's been made much weaker, much much less required in Mythic Plus this season, and therefore you are weaker. But on top of that, you still have this responsibility, this, passive idea that you need to keep people alive, because of course you are the healer. So if somebody dies, it's supposed to be your fault. Another angle to see this perspective from, to just look at it from the healer's side. Think about what you want to do in a Mythic Plus key, which is defeat all the bosses, get to 100% thrash mob requirement before the timer is over, right? That's the goal. So when you look at who helps you going faster in a Mythic Plus key, who gets you to be faster in a Mythic Plus key, you have the tank, which helps you with the pulls. The pulls, the route, the cooldown management, and of course he can stay alive by himself, so his own self-survival. Then you have the DPS, which of course helps you with the damage, which is the biggest part of going fast. The biggest point of being fast in a key is of course how much damage you're going to be doing. That's the biggest help. Not only that, but as we mentioned, things that can stop you from doing damage, like people dying from one-shots, are stopped by things like crowd control, by things like interrupt, which we mentioned have more power, more control on the tank and on the DPS compared to the healer. So now you're left with the healer. What does the healer do to contribute to make the key faster? Is it the crowd control? Not really, compared to tanks and DPS. Is it the interrupts? Not really, compared to tanks and DPS. Is it the DPS? Obviously not. Is it the staying alive from one-shots? So the key would be so much slower if we didn't have a Discipline Priest with a 15-second cooldown pain suppression to save us, right? Obviously not. They don't have that short of a cooldown, and most of the time, to survive one-shots, you first look at the DPS players themselves, using their own defensives first, and then maybe with the help of a healer's external. But that's just a much smaller, much more minor help. Looking back at the initial question, what do you do to speed up a Mythic Plus key? You look at the tanks, and then you look at the DPS players, and then you look at the healers, and again, you see the healers having so much less impact compared to everyone else. If every other pool, every other trash mob had throughput requirements so high that without a healer actually keeping you alive, you would all be dead, then the contribution of a healer would be massive. However, most thrash packs don't have that. Most thrash packs will be something like, pull this entire thing with Bloodlust, either one of the DPS players don't interrupt Waterbolt and one-shot someone, or otherwise the healer is just going to spend 30 seconds doing damage, equipping a DPS trinket and trying to do as much damage as it can, which is still going to amount to barely 10% of the group's damage. How valuable was that? How important was that? How much of a help was that for speeding up the key compared to what the tank did in that pool, compared to what the DPS players did in that pool? That is what is creating this sense of frustration for many healers at the moment in Mythic Plus. The fact that you're not nearly as powerful, you're not nearly as important, you don't help nearly as much, and even the strongest thing you were doing, which was throughput, keeping people alive, has been nerfed massively, because nowadays the biggest threat in Mythic Plus, with the few exceptions of a few bosses, isn't constantly healing people, but rather trying to survive one-shot mechanics. So obviously the question now will be, how do we fix this as we go into Season 4 with the new set of dungeons that might change the damage requirements, the damage taken style of damage that is going to come out from mobs and bosses in the next season, as well as hopefully in the next expansion. So the major suggestion for this problem when it comes to healing and staying alive, when it comes to the value of a healer in a Mythic Plus key, is of course the obvious answer to nerf the self-sustain of everyone and nerf the damage reduction / defensive cooldowns of everyone, so that you can then buff the dungeons to have way higher healing requirements over the course of the dungeon. This will put less responsibility on the DPS players to stay alive by themselves, to properly rotate their defensives, their health potions and their health stones, and instead put that responsibility back on the healer. It shouldn't be a thing that you're pulling a massive pack, you miss an interrupt, the Havoc Demon Hunter gets chunked down to 20% HP, and in 3 seconds, with Leech, with self-healing, the guy just goes back to full HP. Why do we even have a healer if a Havoc Demon Hunter is allowed to do something like that? Why can a Red Paladin self-heal himself to full like a borderline lay on hands whenever he uses Word of Glory on himself? You know, what's even the point of having a healer if you have a spec like that in a Mythic Plus key? And not to mention, these specs often have 2 or even 3 different types of defensives they can use, like Blur for a Havoc Demon Hunter plus an immunity with Netherwalk plus Darkness as well, on top of the self-healing, for example. That would obviously be the first logical suggestion to make for the next season, for example, to lower the amount of one-shots and the amount of try to stay alive if by mistake a single cast goes through that's about to hit you for 1,000,000 damage type of situation, and instead increase the amount of heavy AoE healing that goes off from mobs or from bosses. That, I believe, is one of the features that can help put some power back into the healing. I don't think we need to keep something like this, for example, something like defensive management, as an extra responsibility for DPS players. We have clearly seen in this season, but even in the previous ones, that DPS players have not adapted too well in being given this responsibility. Very often it creates frustration every time you see someone die as a healer, and then you look at the death log and you see that he died with 3 different defensives available, even though the mob was clearly casting a 3-second long mega one-shot cast on him. He had plenty of time to react but did nothing. And the fact that creating this responsibility for the DPS player is making the healer weaker because he has less control over that. He can act way fewer times in trying to save them because either the player has a defensive or is gonna die in 1 hit. You don't have that many ways to save him. You know, a druid has 1 iron bark. Every once in a while he can throw to people. A discipline priest has pain suppression. Every 2 to 3 minutes he can throw to people. It's not something you can do very often as a healer to try to save people from these type of mechanics. What you should be doing is healing often. And if you don't do that, you can feel the weakness of your role in a Mythic Plus key. Because of course healing is your biggest power, and whenever there is no healing, you are, so to speak, exposed. Because as we mentioned at the start, you lose out to plenty / most other specs when it comes to crowd control, when it comes to interrupts, when it comes to single target DPS, AoE DPS, burst DPS, basically every other thing you can do in Mythic Plus besides the healing, you lose out to tanks and to DPS. So that's the problem that many of us wish to be fixed, or at the very least partially fixed in Season 4 of Dragonflight, and then definitely fixed by the time we get in the War Within. To shift a bit more power into the healers when it comes to Mythic Plus and take away some of the responsibility and some of the value or the power onto the DPS that the DPS currently have in Dragonflight Mythic Plus. So this is the debate we are having for today on this Wednesday. I'm going to let you guys have your own thoughts down in the comments, what you feel about this, perhaps from the perspective of a healer yourself, or maybe from the perspective of a bystander, a tank or a DPS player in Mythic Plus keys. For today, on this Wednesday, we are now leaving each other once more, starting by thanking, of course, as usual, all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can, as usual, of course, still be given completely for free. You can start by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, well, I've been here for like 3 hours. This motherfucker has like a 4-hour respawn rate or something. It's really annoying.